Of all the threats scattered across the civilized lands, few are as common or as underestimated as the goblin. They are small, standing only 3 to 4 feet tall and weighing somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds. Runty even by the standards of the smaller races. And up close, a goblin is not a pretty sight. They got a flat face, a broad nose, a wide mouth crammed with small, sharp fangs. Their eyes have this dull, glazed look to them, like there's not a whole lot going on behind them. And they come in shades of bright red to lemon yellow. Their forehead slopes sharply backwards, the pointed ears that they have that just jut out to either side, and then they got these long, dangling arms that just hang almost to their knees. Their skin have all of these weird kinds of colors, like there's yellow goblins, orange goblins, even red goblins. And usually members of the same tribe all share the same hue, but it never really matters because whatever color a goblin is born with, they all usually just end up looking grimy anyways. And everything that they wear and use all takes on the same dingy, soiled character as effectively everything else that they touch. But what is interesting about goblins is that they're not just a single species, but rather they're all part of a broader family of creatures known as goblinoids, a group that, as you all will know, also includes the hobgoblins and the bugbears. Now, they only have a few things in common, of course. They all have the flat faces, the fangs, and the pointed ears, but that's basically where the similarities end. And size is one of the bigger differences that they have. Hobgoblins stand around 6.5 feet tall with dark reddish-brown to gray hides, with a culture that serves a rigid militaristic discipline that goblins just utterly lack. And then you got the bugbears that are even larger, often over 7 feet tall, and weighing over sometimes 300 pounds. They got yellow hides, they got coarse red-brown hair, and they're usually known for being stealthy, which is not at all what hobgoblins even do. So they're all just kind of very different from each other. But you see, the thing is, all goblinoids are bound together by a shared language, an overlapping culture, and, most importantly, and also the reason why the first two things even happen in the first place, is because of a shared divine tyrant. And this is actually the primary reason why all of this, and let's be honest here, clearly different creatures are all considered goblinoids. Okay, so goblinoid religion starts and ends with one name, Maglubiyet, the Mighty One, the Conquering God. However, before we continue, hey fellas, I just want to let you all know that I am currently in the process of closing down some of the warehouses that I've been using to store my Sands of Doom adventure, and so before I start moving a bunch of stuff around, I figured that I would first see if there's any of you who still have not gotten your copy of the book. Sands of Doom is an adventure for characters level 1 to level 11, which took me like 2 full years to write, and hey, if I say so myself, it is pretty damn cool. I'm gonna give you all a 50% discount for those of you who want to purchase it this month, so that anyone who still wants to grab it can go ahead and do so before I place all the books in long-term storage. Now, this is particularly important for you Europeans because right now you can get shipping for like 10 or so euros, but once I move them to the US, that shipping will go up probably a lot. So make sure to take advantage of this now before it is too late. That's a full 50% off, guys, so you better get to it. I also have the adventure fully implemented on Roll20, so if you would rather get it over there, that's perfectly fine too. I have all the tokens made and everything in there, so it's pretty nice. But yeah, if you haven't gotten your hardcover book for Sands of Doom, this is the time, fellas. Thank you all so much for the support. You guys are absolutely amazing. And now, back to the video. See, long before history, the goblinoid races worshipped their own gods and followed their own customs. They were effectively just different species, their own people, but then Maglubiyet rose and subjugated everything in his path, mortal and divine alike. He crushed Kurgobayak, the goblin god. He bound Rugek, god of the bugbears, to his will. He forced the hobgoblin patron Nomok Geya into obedience. The gods and heroes who refused to kneel were broken and discarded. Many species that were conquered who refused to kneel were also broken and discarded until all that was left were those that obeyed, who now we call the Goblinoids. And whatever the Goblinoids were before this divine conquest, their old ways, their old identities, and none of it matters anymore. They are Maglubiyet's people now. This is why they all look so different, is because they were once literally just completely different species, but now they are bound by the domination of Maglubiyet, and so they are just simply considered Goblinoids, bound to each other by force. And now, of course, as you can imagine, Goblinoids do not worship Maglubiyet out of love. There is no gratitude, there's no devotion, no sense of being chosen. They worship Maglubiyet out of raw, abject terror. Fear of the god himself, and fear of what existence might look like without his protection. His legends celebrate strength and treachery, triumphing over all opposition. His doctrine drives Goblinoids to breed relentlessly and overwhelm their enemies through sheer numbers. And this, right here, is one of the fundamental reasons life is so cheap in Goblinoid society. There are always more where the last ones came from. So, what does goblin worship actually looks like in practice? Well, it looks like nothing, basically. In tribes that have a shaman, and that's slightly fewer than half of them, the shaman offers sacrifices of animal blood to Maglubiyet at least once a month, if that. And that would be it. There's no services, there's no hymns, no singing, no theology. In tribes without a shaman, even, religion is basically just this pervasive sense of dread and the habit of invoking Maglubiyet's name when something goes bad. And that would literally be the whole religion. But now, here's where it actually does matter. When groups of Goblinoids from different tribes or even different species encounter each other in the wild, they do not treat that as a mere coincidence. That's where their devotion to Maglubiyet actually comes into play, because they consider that to be Maglubiyet's will that they all came together, a divine command to make them join forces and form a host. And this is actually how scattered goblin bands coalesce into the larger, more dangerous armies that periodically threaten entire regions. And this is why you often see Goblinoids together again, even if they look so different, even if they behave differently. Is because they feel that if they don't, Maglubiyet is gonna do something really bad to them. And so this interaction that they have with this particular kind of god also colors how they interact with one another. Whenever these combinations occur among the goblinoid races, size always determines the dominance. Goblins cannot overpower hobgoblins, and hobgoblins are generally at the mercy of bugbears, and that's just kind of how it works, and is how it usually turns out. Every now and then, of course, a group of smaller goblinoids will band together and try to overthrow a larger cousin, but they almost always end up betraying each other in the attempt. And even when they do manage to succeed, they almost immediately fall into infighting over who gets to be in charge. And then that quarrel would get resolved when another large goblinoid would wander in and then kill the quarreling lot. It's just kind of, so it doesn't matter what happens, it almost always ends in the same place. Now, thankfully though, things do get a little bit more organized, and I would say even more interesting when you're only dealing with one type of goblinoid, because there's an actual caste system, an organizational structure that I think is very interesting, but of course, that will have us actually go pretty deep into how goblins interact, how goblins think, and really just what goblins even are conceptually. So let's take a step back and just talk about goblins. Okay, so goblins are creatures of darkness. Their eyes can see in complete blackness, which makes the deep underground feel more like a home than the surface ever could. Conversely, of course, sunlight is genuinely uncomfortable for them, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that goblins overwhelmingly choose to live below ground. Natural cave systems, abandoned mines, tunnel networks that sit just beneath the surface. I mean, the few tribes that do make their homes above ground will almost always stick to ruins, and even then, they would only venture outside at night or in the darkest, most overcast days, because the sun would just make existence just unbearable for them. Now, each tribe stakes out a stretch of territory that is somewhere between 10 to 30 square miles, with the main lair sitting roughly at its center, and this location, of course, would be defended mercilessly. The fact that goblins are so numerous and they're so sneaky and oddly clever makes it extremely dangerous to approach this area. See, the lair itself is built around two priorities: concealment and defense. You will never see goblins loitering outside their home. They come and go almost exclusively at night, and they take real care to hide any evidence of their passage. Entrances are placed on rocky ground or hard pan surfaces where footprints will not show. And when conditions make tracks unavoidable, like for example if it was snowing, the goblins would actually go the extra mile to cover them up. Or maybe even reshape the footprints to make them look like they were made by deers or bears or any other local wildlife. See, for creatures that are often written off as being stupid, goblins are actually remarkably clever, and you will see how far that goes. But the entrances of the lairs that the goblins use are made to be deliberately small, often small enough that even a goblin would have to crouch or crawl in order to get inside. This, of course, would keep out large predators and make it nearly impossible for anything human-sized to basically storm the opening. But it should suffice to say that at least one entrance of the entire lair should always be large enough to evacuate the entire tribe in a hurry if they needed to. So that's why if you're ever attacking a goblin compound, your first objective would be to find this entrance so that you can actually get in. But of course, as you can imagine, this main exit is usually the most heavily guarded. But now, when you step inside a goblin lair, you would find that it is basically designed to be a maze. You would see winding tunnels, small guard chambers, storerooms, wolf dens, slave pens, all would be all connected to one or more large central rooms where the bulk of the tribe would eat, sleep, and then live together. Only the leaders and other important figures would get private quarters, whereas everyone else would share the very same common rooms. When goblins expand an existing cavern or cave system, the tunnels that they would dig would be narrow and warren-like, so easy for a goblin to navigate, but claustrophobic and uncomfortable for basically anything larger. And of course, nearly every single tunnel would be trapped. The lore says that much of this trap building knowledge is actually very ancient, passed down from an era when goblins besieged and captured dwarven strongholds. Of course, interesting and genuinely powerful trap designs that they would never be able to design from scratch, but has been successfully passed down as survival tricks from generation after generation of goblins, which again is just one thing that goblins are very dangerously good at, and that is surviving. Now, one thing that is consistent basically amongst every single type of goblin lair, no matter where it is or how it's laid out, is that it is filthy. Goblins have no concept of hygiene. Absolutely none. Waste and refuse would basically sit right next to the food and the beddings. You would see fleas and rot grubs and rats that would share the living space freely. You will even often see the goblins willfully eating these pests when food becomes scarce. But what's interesting is that goblins are actually largely immune to the diseases that breed in this kind of squalor, though unfortunately that is usually not the case for the captives that the goblins hold, which often die not as a result of the torture that are inflicted upon them, but from the sickness that they get from the lair. And now, the conditions inside of a goblin lair, so how they are cramped and dark, reeking, and shared by hundreds of bodies, they actually tell you a lot about goblin society. See, goblin life is communal, but in the most uncomfortable sense of the word. There's almost no privacy. The tribe eats and sleeps and exists in all shared spaces. Even their bedding, tangled heaps of stolen rags and straw and dead leaves, they all belong to no one in particular. The only thing that a goblin truly ever owns is whatever that they can carry on their own body. Everything else, from tools to food, is considered to be common stock, used by whoever gets to it first. And whatever treasure that the tribe has accumulated always gets kept in the chieftain's quarters. And that is basically that. So now you might look at this and think that there is something perhaps cooperative about it, but really there isn't. This is actually the primary difference between kobolds and goblins, which if you remember my video on kobolds, you would notice just how many things in common they all actually have. In fact, it's interesting that in first edition, kobolds naturally could speak goblin, and they were literally designed to be so similar, but I digress. So goblins live on top of each other, not to be cooperative, but because their leaders prefer it that way. A goblin that you can see is a goblin who isn't plotting against you, and goblins you cannot see are always plotting against you. Treachery is basically how goblins climb. Every member of the tribe knows exactly who stands above and below them in the pecking order, and every single one of them is perpetually scheming to move up, usually at someone else's expense. And that pecking order, it turns out, is formalized into a very rigid and interesting caste system. Goblin tribes are usually divided into 4 hereditary types of castes. You got the Lashers, the Hunters, the Gatherers, and the Pariahs. And a family's caste is determined usually by the skills and the knowledge that it controls. So a higher caste family would guard their expertise jealously because that expertise is the only thing that keeps them on top. Upward mobility in Goblin culture is very rare, but downward mobility, on the other hand, happens not just frequently, but very violently. Okay, so at the top of this caste system, you have the Lashers. They are the closest thing that Goblin society has to basically a ruling class. These are the families that hold the tribe's most valuable types of knowledge, so military strategy, trap design, beast taming, mining, metalwork, smelting, forging, religious practice. Basically, if the tribe has any kind of knowledge that is important or valuable, it would be owned by the Lashers in that particular group of goblins. And if the tribe has any spellcasters, they will also come from this caste. And the name Lashers comes from the whips that they usually carry, which they, as you can imagine, tend to use very liberally on anyone that's beneath them, and of course, everyone is beneath them. But speaking about those that are beneath them, beneath the Lashers, you have the Hunters, which, as you can imagine, these are basically just the skilled fighters. They're typically the tribe's best wolf riders and the goblins that are most familiar with the far reaches of their tribal territory. In peacetime, these guys usually bring in game, whereas in wartime, they usually serve as scouts, skirmishers, and of course the cavalry. They are usually designed to be competent and dangerous, but they would like the specialized knowledge that would keep the Lashers above them. And then further down, you would have the Gatherers. They forage, they steal food from nearby settlements, they tend to whatever crude farming the tribe is actually managed to learn. They check the trap lines for captured creatures or trespassers. They cook for the tribe. In war times, they prepare the poisons. They just take care of things that require some semblance of skill. Though together with the Pariahs, which would be the guys below them, they're basically the reason why the goblins get their reputation of being hopeless cowards. They are genuinely terrified of battle, and many of them believe sincerely that the higher castes possessed some kind of secret knowledge about how to survive that they do not have. And again, it's because these guys are not meant to fight, so they don't really have those skills, and nobody teaches them those skills. And then, of course, at the very, very bottom of the caste system, you have the Pariahs, the weakest, the dimmest, the most wretched of goblins of the tribe. They muck out the animal pens, they clean up after everyone else, and they basically just do whatever menial, back-breaking labor that the tribe needs that nobody else wants to touch. Their one consolation that they do get is that whenever the tribe takes in a slave, it is the Pariahs that finally get to, boss around the creatures because it is the only thing that they can actually boss around, so it is a job that they usually take very happily. But it is interesting though because this caste system tends to catch outsiders completely off guard. Because you might find yourself encountering, say, a dozen gatherers, and they might run away from you in fear, causing you to think that maybe goblins are not a big deal, and that the fight is over. But then you might be savagely attacked by 2 hunters moments later. Or you might find yourself in a situation in which you're captured in a trap, and then you might notice wave after wave of goblins that would just pass you by without giving you a second glance. And of course, that is simply because these goblins would be of a caste that dealing with intruders is just simply not their job. So this is what usually causes people to get these weird impressions of goblins. Sometimes it's just being cowards, when a lot of times they're just not. Or for being stupid when, let's be fair, most of the time they are, but also a lot of the times they're not. But outside of the caste system, who is it that sits at the very top of this? Well, that is the tribal boss, who rules with an absolute authority modeled directly after the whip-cracking tyranny of the goblin gods. The boss's word is always considered to be law. If you displease the boss, you die, and it really is that simple. In exchange for this power, the boss claims the best of everything that the tribe produces. They surround themselves with the strongest warriors as bodyguards, and of course, they keep their most dangerous rebels close. again by simply surrounding themselves with them as their bodyguards. Goblins are drawn to visible markers of authority, and a tribal boss tends to lean very hard into this regard. They'll carry or display distinctive trappings like a crown or a crude throne or perhaps a high-backed wolf saddle, for example. But it could even be something as like a colorful pair of cool boots. I mean, anything that makes them different looking basically than the rest. And of course, each different caste tends to adopt its own symbols to basically signal their membership into that caste. Though these symbols are usually too weird and non-important looking that you would never be able to notice them. But now, the position of boss is actually sometimes hereditary. A chief's offspring might be raised apart from the communal brood and then given special training and of course groomed to be the next leader. And usually this works reasonably well because goblin genetics tend to be pretty straightforward, such that a large, strong goblin would usually produce a large, strong young. But it does happen that sometimes the heir turns out to be sickly or undersized, and when that happens, the chief will often kill the child personally. Not out of mercy, but out of shame. And when there is no heir at all, succession tends to become something of a bloodbath, with backstabbings and frantic alliance buildings and an open combat, which basically lasts until someone, usually from the lesser families, claws their way up to the top. And so, as you can imagine, a chief's life is one of constant vigilance. Any goblin bold enough and strong enough to kill the current boss can very freely just simply claim the title, which means the threat of assassination never really goes away. Beneath the chief, larger tribes support one or more sub-chiefs who act as military leaders, each with their own bodyguards and their own loyalists, and of course their own web of rivals. And then below those, you would see the informal leaders, so usually just the biggest and meanest and strongest goblin in any particular group of a few dozen who would then enforce orders from above and handle small matters on their own. But there are times when the boss isn't even a goblin at all. When a troll, an ogre, or say a bugbear kills the sitting chief and coasts the rest of the tribe into submission, the goblins basically just adapt. Again, it's all about the strongest. That's just how it always works with goblins. If the new ruler, however, is dim, the upper caste does sometimes immediately start jokering to become the real power behind the figurehead, if it's possible. But if the creature turns out to be too shrewd for that kind of manipulation, of course, the tribe simply falls in line. But now, what's interesting is that almost all of this power, the boss and the sub-chiefs and the lashers, and a lot of what this power is brought upon by the caste system, that is almost always held by the males. Goblin society is deeply patriarchal, and the dominance is rooted purely, as you can imagine, in physical size and strength. Hunting and warfare are, as you can imagine, male domains, and females are expected to bear young and raise them. That's the official picture anyways, but it's not the whole story because females do fight viciously when the lair is invaded. At that point, there is, of course, no caste distinction that matters when the home is under attack. But one of the most fascinating things about goblin lore that you probably didn't know and that I found really interesting is that, statistically speaking, the vast majority of goblin adventurers that you see in the wild are almost always females. And that is because it is the females who are the most likely to leave the goblin life in search for something better than the life that they were assigned. Because again, they don't really have any authority or any power in the goblin lairs that they inhabit. But now, goblin babies are not born into really anything that resembles what you would call a family. A female gives birth in litters, 3 to 7 at a time, and she will do it at least every other year. There is no courtship, there is no pair of bonds. The youngs are usually just simply raised communally, with all of the females looking after them together, and that particular investment is really designed to be purely practical. If a child survives, of course, it'll eventually carry a spear or check a trap line, and so the tribe realizes that you simply have to take care of the children, that's just what they do it. But that's basically the full extent of their concern, because those that are born too weak or too sickly to actually help the tribe, they're just left to die. Now, childhood, for the ones that do make it, is a smaller and crueler mirror of their adult life. The bigger children bully the smaller ones relentlessly, and nobody stops them because that's the whole point. It's how goblins learn what the pecking order is. It's effectively training for the social dynamics that they will face as adults. And of course, plenty of them don't even survive that bullying process. Like, kids die is how bad the bullying is. And between the high infant mortality and the brutal upbringing and the violent deaths that claim adults well before old age, you can imagine how goblin communities tend to have roughly as many children as they have adults at any given time. Now, a goblin is considered an adult and pressed into service at around 10 years of age. In theory, they can live to 50, and a rare few, cunning or exceptionally few, lucky individuals have made it to 60, but in practice, almost none of them ever do. Most die long before that, whether it be in raids or under the claws of something bigger, or at the hands of a rival within their own tribe. But the biggest reason is because when age does finally begin to slow a goblin down, there's just no respect that the other goblins give them. It's not like a goblin is gonna save them any food or is gonna wait for them if they start to slow down. Nobody's gonna patch you up when you break a leg. There's really no such kind of veneration that one gives to the older folk in the goblin culture. At some point, you basically stop being useful and then you're left behind and then you die. A goblin's life is brutal, and their relationship with food is about as brutal as everything else about them. They eat anything that moves and quite a few things that don't. They prefer their meat fresh and raw, and they actually dislike cooking food. It doesn't taste right to them. But of course, as you know, desperation has a way of erasing preferences, and goblins are desperate very often because they hunt every living creature in their territory with such enthusiasm that they often strip an area completely bare of any and all game whenever they move into an area. It's actually one of the main reasons why they have evolved into a race of raiders and thieves, because they always seemingly keep finding themselves in situations where they just simply run out of food. Now, these guys have no concept of animal husbandry. There's no understanding of resource management. Whenever they steal livestock, it is basically consumed immediately. The idea of maintaining a herd, of planning for the next season, like, these things simply do not occur to them. Once a tribe has exhausted the resources of an area, they simply move on to the next. And so, really, everything about how goblins live, and especially about how they fight, they all come down to one honest truth about themselves. They are small, they are weak, and individually, they are outmatched by almost anything that might threaten them. And the thing is that goblins know this. The concept of a fair fight doesn't really exist in their thinking. Instead, they know that they have to rely on numbers, on cunning, and on absolute willingness to fight dirty. When enemies push into their territory, goblins do not try to meet them in an equal battle. They can't, and they know it. What they do instead is something close to, I guess, what you would define as guerrilla warfare. They do these fast, vicious raids that are launched from hidden positions. They strike hard, they draw blood, and then they vanish into caves and tunnels before the enemy has a time to regroup. They know every path, every crevice, every bolt hole of their territory, and they'll hit you from a completely different direction the next time that you show up. The goal is never to win a straight-up fight. Instead, to harass, to exhaust you, and whenever possible, to lure intruders away from their lair and more into a location where they have prepared a trap or an ambush. And they actually coordinate all of this way better than you would expect. See, and a big reason for that is because their hearing is actually way sharper than a human's, especially underground where sound is designed to carry well. Guards are outfitted with drums or gongs or horns so that they can signal the rest of the tribe if there's any danger. And in fact, many tribes even require every single adult male to carry a whistle or a horn at all times. And when distance or stealth would rule out noise, they instead would use runners, particularly fast goblins that are assigned to every single patrol specifically to run in between the different groups to alert them of whatever's going on. And it is this communication that makes the hit and run tactics that they use function so particularly well, because every single patrol knows where the others are and what is happening all across their territory. And then if an enemy actually breaches their backline or breaches the lair itself, they all know when to back away and then fight as a unit inside of this lair. Because to them, it is the most defensible area that they control. They have all of these winding tunnels, they have all of these cramped side chambers designed to allow them to continue this guerrilla-style warfare. And of course, they have all of these traps that they have been building up for this particular moment. But the thing about goblins is that they actually never fight to the death, which in an ironic way is actually what dooms many of these tribes, because the moment that a goblin force faces an enemy that they can tell that they cannot defeat, that's when morale shatters all at once, all in a single tide of panic. The entire tribe floods towards the exits and just flees. See, in theory, every tribe has a designated grouping area somewhere in the territory that they're supposed to meet up when something like this happens, but in practice, most goblins get so blinded by the terror of dying that they never remember where it is. In fact, a tribe that loses its lair typically loses an additional fifth of its surviving members just to the route itself. Because some of these goblins get lost. They're so afraid they can't even think straight, and so they get lost and get eaten by a random wolf. Or they trip upon themselves and just crack their necks open. Kind of pathetic in a weird way, but it's almost kind of funny. But now let's take a step back and actually talk about something a little bit more positive about the goblins. So if there is one genuine bond in goblin life, one relationship that is not built on fear or exploitation or convenience, it is the one that they share with wolves and wargs, which of course we all are aware of because we keep finding them together all the time. Now, this partnership is ancient. It's been around at least as long as the bond between humans and dogs, and it serves many of the same functions. The wolves would guard and scout and hunt and fight alongside the tribe. But to them, it's not really a source of domestication. Wargs would not be, for example, considered to be pets or livestock or really servants, but also not friends either. To them, it would just be an organization of trust and convenience. They're basically the closest that they have to being real allies. Wargs often live in dens right inside of the goblin lair, and funnily that they actually frequently eat better than the majority of the tribe. Some goblins train as wolf riders and of course take their companions into battle. Others simply fight alongside them on foot, but either way, the relationship is sort of designed to be that of mutual respect. And probably the only respect that you would ever find anywhere close to a goblin society. Of course, rats are often seen with goblins, and they also share the living space, though that type of partnership really is less about respect and is more just an accepted part of goblin life. Everything is just so dirty inside that rats just kind of move in, and there's really no other way around it, so they basically just don't mind each other, which again is also kind of funny. And another really interesting thing about goblins that usually you wouldn't think about when you think about goblins is magic. So spellcasters of really any kind are exceedingly rare in this particular species, and the reasons are kind of obvious. Most goblins lack the patience or the intellect for being wizards. Sorcerous bloodlines are just not common at all in goblins. In fact, there are less commons in goblins than they are in really any other race. The gods that goblins have are very stingy with their divine power, and so they almost never share it with their followers. And of course, while plenty of goblins would happily accept a warlock's bargain with a patron, the patrons who offer such deals typically know perfectly well that a goblin is very unlikely to ever hold up its end of any bargain that they make. So they never do. And then even when a goblin does turn out to have genuine magical talent, any particular tradition that goblin would start would usually only survive maybe one generation, two at its maximum. The goblins just have so little collective experience with magic that they don't really know how to keep it and how to teach it to their young. And they don't even distinguish it between all the different forms of magic. To them, wizardry and sorcery, divine power, pact magic, these are all just collectively the same thing, and this they call Booya. That's the word for magic, Booya. The word gets attached to the name of basically any practitioner that has any kind of inclination to magic. And a goblin who wields Booya automatically enters into the Lair caste. And to be fair, usually becomes the leader of that tribe. That's just how rare and impressive it is. It's actually funny that, as rare as they are, of course, whenever a wild magic sorcerer goblin appears, I find this super funny. The tribe calls them Booya, 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 because when you cast a spell, more magic is of course triggered by that spell, because that's how wild magic works. So a Booya causes another Booya, which causes another and another, and you get where I'm coming from. So it's just Booyas all over the place. So that's just how they're called. It's kind of a weird, goofy thing, but I wanted to mention it because it's just hilarious. So, after everything that we have covered, what's actually going on inside of a goblin's head? Beneath the cowardice, beneath all the cruelty and the filth, there is actually something worth understanding. The fundamental drive of every goblin ultimately really is survival. Not comfort, not happiness, not ambition in any form that you or I would recognize, just the raw, desperate need to keep breathing just for one more day. A goblin will endure any humiliation, any pain, any degradation, rather than to face death. So it's not really courage as much as it is just this clinging, like animal terror of non-existence that shapes every single decision that a goblin makes. And maybe it's just because they feel that all that's waiting for them in the afterlife is Maglubiyet. And ultimately they are just so terrified of Maglubiyet. So at least that would make sense. But once you understand this about like goblin psychology, everything else will just sort of fall into place. The cruelty would make sense. It's just how they establish the dominance that then keeps them alive. The servility makes sense because submission is far safer than any kind of resistance. The slavery that they do on those that they capture makes sense because they understand on a level deeper than thought that the only alternative to holding the whip is to feel it. Their gods were conquered and bound their entire race to his will. So even their souls are not their own. They belong to Maglubiyet. In a world like that, the only rational response is to dominate whatever it is that you can, to hoard whatever it is that you find, and to just run the moment that any odd ever turns against you. And that is just the goblin experience. That's what it is. Goblins feel very few emotions that other races would recognize as complex. Hate would be one, despair, constantly, loathing for others, potentially, and probably for themselves, but friendship, trust, maybe something as basic as hope, those would be luxuries that don't survive in any goblin tribe. Loyalty extends exactly as far as self-interest demands, and really not a step further. If you're feeling generous, and after everything that we've talked about, you should not, but the kindest interpretation of goblin behavior really is that they are a people so thoroughly broken by their gods, by their history, by the unrelenting brutality of their very own society that really nothing resembling warmth or trust has ever survived that process. They didn't start this way, probably, but doesn't matter because this is what they are now. But I will say this. Goblins might be one of the few races that your experience meeting one might actually differ dramatically just simply based on what kind of childhood that creature had. It actually makes complete sense why you might find a goblin in a human city that grew up with humans that might actually just be a normal creature, not some psychopathic, murderous, tiny minion. And that's why you do tend to see goblin adventurers. The most goblinoids who leave their tribes to become adventurers do so out of that feeling of pure survival instinct, because they're convinced that if they stay, they'll be killed. And many of them are right. A few leave with dreams of finding power in a wider world and returning one day to seize control of their homeland. And of course, there are those very rare few that leave because they genuinely do want something better. But even those who sincerely try to break the cycle, they all tend to fall back into familiar patterns when the opportunity presents itself. But just how there are those goblins that do find something better, and they do change their ways, most of them do end up falling back into those familiar patterns whenever the opportunity arises. They seek out weaker beings to bully, they form crude hierarchies, they recreate, in miniature, basically just the same miserable societies that they once fled. Because ultimately, goblins are just small, wretched, numerous wild beings that sometimes can be a little funny. Thank you all so much for watching. Please remember that I am running a massive 50% off on my Sands of Doom hardcover book for the month, so do not miss out, fellas, because I am going to be moving whatever books I have left into long storage, and I am not sure for how long I'll be able to have them up for sale in the store. So this is the time. Also, as always, we have a Patreon packet to accompany the video on the Patreon for those of you who support me over there. I cover the biology, ecology, and hierarchy of the goblins, as well as a bunch of other things. It includes both the important lore that we covered today on the video, but also mechanics and stat blocks so that you can actually use that content in your own games. I do this for all of my videos, so if you support me on Patreon, you can get this one and all of the rest that I have ever made. So it's a pretty good deal now. But yeah, thank you all so much for supporting and for watching the video. You guys are incredible. And now I'll see you all next time.